Alright, so the year is 2018, and you somehow ended up with a Pentium G4560 in your possession. And you think, can I really game off of this? I mean, the prices for everything out there are so high, and your wallet's only so big. So can you really make a true budget build that games? So you go out, you get yourself a B250 motherboard and a 1050 Ti, and you're just wondering, is this going to be enough? Let's find out.
So, before we get right into it, a few of the things that we need to note is the specs of the computer in which we are testing. So, I have below, you can find a PC part picker list to this, but we can go through it real quick right here. I got an Intel Pentium G4560 3.5 GHz dual core processor with hyper threads, so the computer's going to think that there's 4 cores. I do have an AIO from Corsair, an H60. It's just a 120mm AIO, followed by an MSI B250M Pro VD motherboard. I have 2 4GB sticks of RAM from G-Skill running at 2133. I have a, it says 32, but I actually have a 64 variant of a ADATA SSD for the operating system, and then a 1TB drive for all of the games in which we are testing today. And then as far as the case goes, it's all inside of a Cooler Master Box Lite 3.1. You can find a video to the review of that below as well. And then EVGA 400 watt power supply, nothing fancy. So the first video card in which we are testing that is a tiny picture. The first video card in which we are testing is a MSI, there we go, is the MSI GeForce GTX 1050 Ti, the Gaming X edition. So just your standard MSI graphics card. And then for a counterpart we have the 1060. We have the EVGA GeForce GTX 1060. So these are the 2 different graphic cards in which we are going to test on the system. So let's go ahead and get right to the charts. So the first chart that we see here is the PC Mark chart. You'll see there's not really much of a difference because, let's face it, PC Mark isn't really testing anything GPU based or bound. So we're going to move on over to 3D Mark. I did 3 different tests here for 3D Mark. I did the Skydive, the Firestrike, and the Time Spy for 3D Mark. So you'll notice though, Skydive for the 1050 Ti got a 16379 score. 1060 has a 20,000 mark. And then it's just a good like 22% difference. But the further down this line we go, the further away it goes. So Firestrike here is about a 6,500, and then a 8,900, or almost 9,000 here. So this right here is actually a good 39% difference from from the 1050 Ti to the 1060 gig. Moving on to Time Spy, we had a 2,443 mark for the 1050 Ti, and then a 3,805 mark for the 1060, giving it a 55% increase over its 1050i counterpart. Moving on now to VR Mark, the 1060 definitely blew out the 1050 Ti. We have a 2,308 for the 1050 Ti in Cyan, but a 3,876 for the 1060. And the 1050 Ti got a good 4,134 in orange, and yet the 1060 on the other hand here got a good 5,829. So it's a good 67% difference for Cyan, and then a good 41% difference for orange here. Moving on to some actual gameplay now. The average maximum that I had gotten while playing Titanfall on the 1050 Ti was 145, and the 1060 on the other hand was 140. So 5 frames per second difference, and it's actually backwards. The 1060 got less than the 1050 Ti, so I could call this a margin of error. Meanwhile, the average frame for the 1050 Ti was 115, and the 1060 had 127. So this is not going to be too noticeable, especially if you have a 120 frames per second cap limit on your screen. However, the big difference you're going to notice between the 1050 Ti and the 1060 on Titanfall is the minimum frames. So when you have your frames drop, it is not good. In the 1050 Ti, the average was about 23 frames. Meanwhile, the 1060 actually held its ground above, just right below actually, the 90 frames per second mark at 89.4 frames a second. So that is not bad at all. Moving to Fortnite, maximum frames a second. Again, this is a 1050 Ti with 104 and the 1060 with 108. Again, this is so close, we could call this a margin of error. And then for the average frames per second, we're looking at 81 for the 1050 Ti and 82 for the 1060. So again, I would consider this a margin of error. And lastly, the minimum frames per second, which I found this to be very interesting. I don't know why, but I would have assumed that the 1060 would have blown the 1050 Ti out of here. However, the 1050 Ti is at 60 frames a second, and the 1060 is looking at 51 frames a second for the minimums. This, to me, I'm just confused. I honestly don't know why this happened this way, but I would almost say margin of error, but error on my behalf. So I'm still learning about all of this. I just thought it'd be fun to do a 1050 Ti versus 1060 on a Pentium system and whether or not you can actually game on these. Moving on to Rainbow Six Siege now. The 1050 Ti had a maximum of about 100 frames, and then the 1060 was looking at 141. So 1060 is rocking it here. And then for the average, your 1050 Ti was looking at about 77 frames a second, and the average for the 1060 was 103. For the minimums, the 1050 Ti had 53 and a half frames a second, and the 1060 was looking at about 77 and a half. So 53 and 77. So as far as all of this goes with Rainbow Six Siege, you're looking at about a 33 to 45% difference on some of these. I would say you're more closely looking at about 35% of a difference here. So next up on the list was Fruit Ninja. And Fruit Ninja, I could not figure out with this VR game how to make the frames per second exceed 90 FPS. But here we go. So 90 FPS for the 1050 Ti and the 1060 for the max. Average is about 89 for both. Minimum, however, you got about 86 on the 1050 Ti, and for whatever reason, 82 on the 1060. I would call this a margin of error, and me not knowing how to unlimit the cap on a HTC Vive system. Next, we're going to move into the slingshot. The reason why we did the slingshot is that this one is going to be more CPU intensive. There's a lot more stuff moving around here. So, we have the slingshot, we have maximum frames for the 1050 Ti is looking at about 86, 87, and then for the 1060 you're looking at 90. Then when we move on to the average, you're looking at an average of 46 frames on average with the 1050 Ti, or 88 frames on average with the 1060. Or minimums, you're looking at about 38 frames a second with the 1050 Ti, and for the 1060 you're looking at 68 frames. So that is a huge increase right there, a good 92% difference with the average and a good 78% difference with the minimum. I do have to say, while playing this with the both the 1050 Ti and the 1060, there were stutters and stops sometimes when massive amounts of physics were going on. So I do not recommend playing the slingshot on a Pentium G4560. Moving on to Battlefield 1, and this looks ugly. The 1050 Ti maximum was about 48. Meanwhile, the 1060 was 113. The average for the 1050 Ti was 29 frames a second. Meanwhile, for the 1060, 71. The minimum frames for the 1050 Ti was 12, and for the 1060 was 28. Guys, this was absolutely the hardest thing for me to benchmark because I did not want to stop benchmarking. I wanted to get valid results. This game was so irritating to play with both the 1050 Ti and the 1060. Yes, the maximum was 113, The average was 71, but when it did drop below 30 or below 40, I noticed. So I would say that if you are going to play this game with the 1060, put a frame cap on this guy. If you put the frame cap on a 60 frames a second, it's a lot smoother gameplay. So, moving onward now to PUBG. PUBG with the 1050 Ti, you're looking at 80 frames for maximum, 56 for average, and a 25 for the minimum. Meanwhile, for the 1060, you're looking at 118 for the maximum, 84 for the average, and 31 for the minimum. Guys, again, this was just hard to play on a Pentium system. PUBG is so, as you know, esports ready, but not well polished. So there is some mechanics that need to be fixed, both in the game, and I think it's just so intensive that a Pentium G4560 is not valid.
Oh, what? Kurt!
Lastly, let's move on to Grand Theft Auto 5. Maximum was 86 frames a second for the 1050 Ti, average was about 61, and your minimum was about 29. Meanwhile, for the 1060, not too different. It had 170 for the max, a good 78 for the average, and a good 35 for the minimum. If you, again, I think, put a frame cap on this to not exceed 60, this would be a decent game to play with the Pentium, paired with the 1060, not a 1050 Ti. So what did we learn, really? Well, gaming off a Pentium is possible, but it's not necessarily the best route to go. So I think as far as all the other components that we've had installed, they're just fine. The only real thing that we would want to change would be our CPU. I would definitely say a Pentium can game, but not ideal for gaming. Definitely get yourself something higher up on the food chain, but if you are just trying to get into the door and the prices for everything are as high as they are, then this may be something to get you started with if you cannot wait. But I do recommend you do wait, you do save up, and get yourself a better CPU. Alright guys, so this video was really different for me, so if you liked the video, go ahead and leave a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, go ahead and leave a thumbs down, I understand. Feel free to give me comments and feedback, what sort of things you would prefer to see in a video like this where we were testing things. So give me your feedback. I tried looking online for everything, you know, how to and whatnot. I made sure I did multiple tests to make sure that everything actually came out about even or about right, and when things were off, I try to figure out why. So feel free to let me know in the comments below. Until next time.